Did you know that Charles Ponzi actually had nothing to do with the first Ponzi scheme? The first Ponzi scheme actually took place all the way back in 1869. While the story of the Ponzi scheme dates back to the 1860s, the scam continues to happen to this day. In this video, we'll explore exactly what a Ponzi scheme is and what you can do to protect yourself. A Ponzi scheme is basically a form of fraud aimed at people who are trying to invest their money and build their wealth. In these schemes, investors are usually lured in with promises of exorbitant returns within a very short period of time, all within the guise of a legitimate business. Now, in these schemes, the earlier investors can make a profit, but they're unaware that these so-called profits are actually money from other investors. They're not from any legitimate business endeavors. As long as new investors continue to join the scheme and invest, earlier investors can continue to get paid. That is why a Ponzi scheme can end up feeling like a legitimate business. But the one criteria is that the scheme needs to keep on bringing new investors to contribute to that fund. The other criteria is that earlier investors need to stay happy with their so-called profits. They must not demand a full repayment of their initial investments. If they do, then the scheme will slowly start to unravel. But as long as they're happy with the so-called profits and they continue to believe in the non-existent assets they supposedly own in the scheme, then the fraud can continue to exist. The more you think about it, the more you start to realize how this all ends up feeling like a house of cards. It's a delicate balance to keep the scheme running, but it becomes rather unstable if any of the investors start to get wise. So why is it called Ponzi? It started with a man named Charles Ponzi. In the 1920s, Charles carried out this scheme and he became well known in the United States because of the amount of money he could swindle. Charles's Ponzi scheme was based on the legitimate arbitrage of international reply coupons for postage stamps. He basically promised clients a 50% profit within 45 days or a 100% profit within 90 days by buying discounted postal reply coupons in other countries and redeeming them at face value in the US as a form of arbitrage. In reality, Ponzi was paying earlier investors using the investments of later investors. Nowadays, this method of fraud is almost immediately known as a Ponzi scheme. However, this type of fraudulent investment scheme was not actually invented by Ponzi himself. The first type of this kind of fraud was actually discovered back in the 1860s. However, with Charles Ponzi and his postage stamp scheme, the fraud became so famous that people started associating this type of fraud with his name. And today, over 100 years later, it's still called the Ponzi scheme. Charles's scheme ran for over a year before it collapsed, and it costed investors over $20 million. Now that's a huge chunk of money back in the 1920s. So, since Ponzi schemes are still so prevalent in 2023, how could you identify them? When you are presented with an investment opportunity, there are actually several red flags that you should look out for to see if they are a Ponzi scheme. So here are a few. High investment returns with little or no risk. Now, every investment carries some degree of risk, and investments yielding higher returns actually involve more risk. So if you're presented with a guaranteed investment opportunity, you should always be suspicious. Overly consistent returns. Now, this probably sounds a bit strange, but when you think about it, investment values tend to go up and down over time, especially the investments that offer high returns. An investment that continues to generate regular positive returns regardless of overall market conditions is a big red flag. Unregistered investments. Ponzi schemes typically involve investments that have not yet been registered with financial regulators. So when you're investing in something, ask for the regulatory approval status and paperwork before joining. Secretive or complex investment strategies. Investments that cannot be understood or on which there is no information that can be found should always be considered suspicious. Difficulty receiving payments. Now, investors should also be suspicious in cases where they don't receive a payment or they have difficulty cashing out. Ponzi scheme promoters will often try to prevent participants from cashing out by offering even higher returns for staying inside the fraud. So if you see this, stay away and report it. Now, investments these days are pretty straightforward, especially given the vast amount of information and resources available. It's always prudent to equip yourself with the right information and knowledge. But Ponzi schemes are still alive and well, and that's largely due to lack of education or greed for very high returns. The best way to combat this is to learn more and to be aware, but also to keep in mind that anything that's too good to be true is probably untrue. Keep your wits about you and stay vigilant.